Good day to you. My name is Afrika Mhlophe. This program is called Pressing Matters. We're looking at contemporary and contentious issues from a biblical perspective. And we're finalizing a talk on church and politics and looking at what's the role of the church and how we address the sphere of politics and how do we influence it and how do we allow ourselves not to be governed by it, but to govern it. And I remember at some point I had a discussion with students at UCT and in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I was asked a question, and the question was about protest, a God-glorifying way of protesting. It's a very interesting question. Because students raise a very legitimate issue that of lack of access to tertiary institutions or institutions of higher learning, and how do they navigate that space of exorbitant fees, which makes access to university difficult for those who can't afford it. So they were asking me a question as to how do we engage in that space and still maintain our faith? So the reality is this: there are students who need access to higher education. So they have to deal with the same things everybody else deals with, but they want to do so in a way that they don't lose their faith. And within that space, there's racial polarization, racial issues that are beginning to crop in. It was primarily about fees. From the beginning, it was about fees and access to higher education, and it took in racial tones, and it began to be very strongly hateful in some instances, with people with inscriptions and placards addressing specific racial groups with very strong, hate-filled words. So they're asking that. And then asking me also a question about violence within protest, whether you should use violence within protest situation in terms of destroying buildings, throwing stones, blocking access to institutions of higher learning, and obstructing people or intimidation. Is the Christian supposed to do such things and to shut down the institution, to make the point, or to take a fire extinguisher and to open it up in the classroom and everybody else suffocate and, whatever. These are tactics that have been used, in this kind of protest. And so I realized that one of the very interesting situations that I was led to the story where Jesus made a whip. Remember when we went to the temple and they were selling in the temple, and he made a whip and drove them out. And so somebody led me to that and showed me and said that, but Jesus engaged in premeditated violence. He made a whip and came into the temple with a whip and whipped them out. I thought, wow, that was quite interesting. I didn't think a person would use that to rationalize using violence today. So I had to study this scripture. And all 3 synoptic gospels, this story is mentioned. But no other gospel mentions the whip except John. So John says, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, John 2:13, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold ox, sheep, and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the money changers' money and overturned the tables. And said to those who sold doves, take these things away, do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. And so people say, but Jesus made a whip, and therefore it means he engaged in premeditated violence. And I began to look at this context, and I realized it doesn't say that. He made the whip, but he also drove out animals. Now, when you drive out animals in those days, you drove them out with a whip. Okay? But it doesn't say he whipped people. That's inference in the text. It's inferring in the text what you want the text to say. He drove them. The word drove, the same word the Holy Spirit drove Christ into the wilderness to be tempted. The same word used to drive out demons. It involves force, but not necessarily physical force. This word, it's a strong word to drive out, but it doesn't necessarily translate into physical force. Okay? So he was stern, he was hard, he was strong, he was emphatic about them coming out of the temple and not selling in there. But there's nothing that says that the whip connected with a person's flesh. Not in this context. And only John speaks about the whip. So a person, I said, but it's very interesting that you will take Jesus and portray him to be a violent person using one unclear biblical text. It doesn't say it so clearly. And I said to them, but where Jesus clearly was justified to use violence, he eschewed it. A woman caught up in adultery came and they brought her. They said, Master, Rabbi, this woman, we have caught her in the very act. Interestingly, they have caught in the very act. Somehow they didn't catch the other party to the adultery. in the very act. You know, so it's very convenient. They're caught in the very act, but they only caught her in the very act and not her partner. And so they brought her there, and Jesus, the rabbi, only one who can sanction the sentence of stoning, said to them, let him who has no sin cut the first stone. He's the only one who's sinless in that context, and there he eschewed violence. And also where they come to arrest him, and Peter cut the ear of a jailer, a person come arrest him, and they restored it. So in two instances where violence would have made sense, Jesus goes the other way. So a person would then use a scripture verse where it's not clearly demonstrating Jesus' connection between Christ and violence, and then use that to rationalize violence. And where he should have used violence, and portray this Jesus as a violent person. So what do I think about Christianity and politics and protest in particular? I do believe that people have to stand for what is an injustice. We see this in Martin Luther King Jr. in America in the civil rights movement, what is called passive resistance. They stood, they registered a protest against the oppression of black Americans. So standing against something doesn't necessarily mean you're not Christian. In fact, it says for evil to thrive, for evil to grow, it's for good people to do nothing. So Christians have to do something. But what is that something that they have to do? We have to write petitions. We have to protest. We have to register our feelings about an issue. But we have to be very careful that when you've done that, you still have to go to home and sleep peacefully. Christians don't only deal with how they appear to the world, they also have to deal with how their conscience addresses them. And their conscience is governed by the Holy Spirit. So after you've done what you have done, you still need to go to bed and sleep peacefully and feel that you have not done anything that dishonors God. Because you don't only stand for personal rights. The matter of fact is, Christians don't only stand for their personal rights, they stand for God's glory. So it's not so much how you feel about an issue, but it's also about what is God's word says on that issue. And second thing that you must consider about politics of South Africa in particular is this. I've had a problem with Christians who protest only on an issue that affects them. Only on an issue that affects them. I ask people, why you are protesting? Because these people have closed the roads and access. But you have not protested when 43 people are killed every day. You have not protested when so many women are raped every minute. So none of these things matter to you except that which affects you personally. And you call yourself a person of justice when you only care for nothing else except yourself and what concerns you. Do you know how many children are great? I mean, if you were God, let me ask you, if you were God, and sitting up in heaven, somebody was complaining to you as God because they didn't have opportunity to have their second degree or higher degree or postgrad degree because of some expenses, and they come to you with a complaint as God. But there's a child in the street who goes to bed without food. Which one will you be prioritizing? Would you be more moved by a person who wants to do a postgrad degree or second degree compared to a child who goes to bed without food? Why is it that what matters to us, we think it should be what matters most to God? The Bible says that what is true religion is to take care of the widow, the orphan, to visit the widow and the orphan, and the elderly. So if we're people of justice, that is holistic, just not just subjective, not just personal, but we would look at every injustice in the world and be able to stand against that. Not only that which affects you. In other words, you look at a race in this country that is being marginalized, that is not your race, and then stand against that. If you cared about justice, you would look at a group of people, the Khoisan in this country, whose language is not recognized, and whose rights are not recognized, and you would say, that's not right. If you only look at what matters to you, you're not really a person of justice. You're a person who only cares about your needs being met. And that's natural. That selfishness is a natural thing of human beings. Christianity is rising above selfishness and tribal issues and small issues and have a parochial vision. So therefore, if we want to engage in politics, we have to understand, we have to come into the space of politics aware of the fact that we can't just focus on our personal needs being met. Our needs, yes, matter, but they're not the only needs out there. For instance, I'll give an example. I mean, obviously, as you can notice, I'm a male. I hope that's very clear. But imagine that I cared nothing else except what my gender or needs. I have a daughter. So it means I cannot just focus. So I study and I look at issues of misogyny and violence against women and children and patriarchy and that. And I realize I cannot raise my daughter in a world like this. So now I cannot just focus on what matters to me as a person. I must focus on the world itself, what kind of a world I want to have around me. Then that to me is more the way I think Christians ought to address the world. Is look at the world and injustice in general, and I look at a person who's lesbian or gay, and look at how the person is treated by the church. I don't believe in being gay. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you believe in being gay or not. That's not the issue. The issue is the church treating people of that orientation with the necessary care and love that God expects of them. Not do they agree with their orientation, but are they loving them? Again, I said love is not an endorsement of a person's behavior. It's an endorsement of God's sovereignty and wisdom. So whether you agree or not with the person's sexual orientation is besides the point. The point is, have you loved the person? Okay. So if you're a person of justice and somebody was mistreated because of the color of their skin, because of their orientation or their belief, you have to protest with as much energy as you would have had your rights being affected or infringed on. If you can't do the same thing for that person as you want to do for yourself, then you're a selfish individual. Now, politicians who have changed the world are those, as Mandela stood on the dock in 1963 when he stood on that court, and he said, all my life I've devoted my life to fight against white oppression and racism by white people and by black people. And he made the point that even if racism comes from black people or white people, I stand on the same principle of non-racialism. So I'm not only fighting racism as it emanates from white people, I fight it from every source it comes from. So if you are so-called black and you saw or overheard the black people speaking in a very, in a way that puts descending or that is not correct as a Christian, you hear people talk about these people and you're in that space and you keep quiet. But when there's other people speak about you, you don't keep quiet. Then you're inconsistent. You cannot be trusted. You're a chameleon. You are not consistent. You must be as consistent against evil from whatever source it comes from. Without choosing color, without choosing sides. You just choose truth. So if this person who's your uncle says something wrong, he's as wrong as the other person next door. Does that make sense? That's how I think we should address politics. Let me stop there and maybe allow for questions that may be available.
Pastor Afrika, I have a question about church politics, the role of the church in the politics, and justice. So previously, 1995, the church was involved heavily in politics in terms of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in terms of acquiring or finding justice for the people, wasn't it not incorrect or that the church brushed away the issues and didn't, with as much enthusiasm, fight issues on both sides in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which made it look like a witch hunt? And with that being said, now we're dealing with issues that we were supposed to have dealt with 1995, and now it's not resolved. So is the church now, if we're yet again going to try and merge church and politics, going to fall into the same trap where we take a side as the church and not take God's view on the situation, rather take a side, and then from taking a side, then are not acquiring full justice? How do we prevent that as a church from happening?
Yeah, well, I think we should learn from our mistakes. I mean, at least, it says that the foolishness is when you repeat the same thing and expect different results. That's a sign of insanity. So if we repeat the same thing we did and expect different results, it will seem to me indicate that we're insane. So I would think that we should be learning from our mistakes. What did we learn from what happened in 95, 96 during the transition period? And we sort of know now that we are seeing a cathartic experience right now in the country, a burst out of emotions, of things that have been undealt with, that were hidden under. Even the church itself, if you look at churches today that are multiracial, most of them are not multicultural. And there's difference. Multiracialism and multicultural is not the same thing. Multiracialism is people sitting next to each other like you're sitting in a bus. That's multiracialism. And people in a bus don't have to know each other. They don't have to know each other's experience. They might share the same bus space, going to different destinations, but they don't have to share life together. So multiculturalism means I'm interested in your life, what goes on in your life, and I allow your culture to be expressed in the church. Not only dominated by one culture. Okay? So that's different. So most churches are not multicultural, they're multiracial. It's still dominated by one culture, but there's multiracial. So the church doesn't know how to navigate that space. So we sit next to, we have coffee together, and we think we know each other. We don't know each other. We know each other's experience, each other's situation. And so that's why I think it's Heartlines, there's a program called Know Your Story, where people come together. They start with leaders, that in Paul Elizabeth, that Christian leaders, pastors came together for 2 days, share your personal story, how you understand the history of the country from your perspective, of what you went through. Because I think we're ignorant of each other's experience of things. You know, there's assumptions on both sides. The other side assume the other side is better off because of the color of the skin, and everyone on that side is doing well and all that. And therefore might be exaggeration on some point. The other side assumes that everybody else wants to get our things. They don't want to work, they're lazy, they just want to come and get our things and all of that. So it's to and fro. The church always must be in the middle, reconciliating these two forces together. So it's wrong for us to take one side or the other. But the truth is always going to be one that reconciles the two. Okay? So, but we have to know what we're dealing with here. Matter of fact, I must say that this land which we're fighting about is not our land. It's not black people's land. It's not white people's land. It's God's land. It's our common inheritance. The primary thing that God has given us is the kingdom of God. That's our primary inheritance. The secondary thing we share is the land called South Africa. That's secondary. These two things, and we steward the land on God's behalf. So we don't keep the land for my family's inheritance, for my own personal wealth. I steward it on God's behalf. So if He speaks to me to share it with others to advance His kingdom, I do that because I'm concerned about the glory of the King rather than for eternal wealth in my family line. Okay? So if my family is primary focus and I keep the land for 100 years for speculative purposes, to sell it later off at an exorbitant price, because that means I'm only concerned about wealth generation for my family rather than about advancing God's kingdom. If advancing God's kingdom was primary, I'll be concerned about building an orphanage if I have to build an orphanage for children who have not homes. So it depends on what we are focusing on. But the important thing is that the kingdom of God is our primary inheritance, together, which we share. And secondarily, we're given stewardship over countries. And that's temporary. Nobody will keep the land forever, because when they die, they leave the land behind. But if they lost Christ because of the land, they were prepared to kill for the land and die for the Lord, they will be shocked when they get there. Because nobody will get there. Nobody came into here with a wheelbarrow with a piece of land or soil from somewhere. We all found it here. So I mean, if it's your land, where did you get it from? You got it here, and therefore you're going to leave it here. You're going to come out of here with nothing, because nothing you came and nothing you want to live with. But if you didn't stand for Christ, or you did something against your brother, you will not be very proud when you stand before the King. So I think the church has to go back to the basics of what it means to be a child of God, what it means to be a true person of justice, even to the degree of even if I have to lose personal material things for the sake of Christ. Let's say I don't have land and no car, but I must not lose Jesus.
Hi, Pastor Afrika. I just have a question. As aspiring ministers, if, for example, we have a global ministry one day and we have many politicians come to our church, what is our responsibility then as ministers of the gospel? Do we be, let's just say they're from different political parties in the nation?
Yeah.
What is our stance towards them? What would you say? I mean, yes, we preach the gospel, but what stance do we take as ministers with them? Do we pursue a relationship with them, or what is our stance?
Well, everybody who comes to church who must pursue a relationship, whether they're politicians or they're the person still sleeping on the street. Christianity is a relational thing. It's not just a positional thing from the pulpit. So minister has to know the sheep. You know, it says, we know the sheep in which you've been given oversight. So if one of the sheep is a politician, my responsibility is the same to him as it is to a poor person, discipleship. So I disciple him. And first of all, discipleship, there's a part of it that is common, that is the values of Christ, and then it gets into zooming into how you express those values within politics. So I might then take him to a different class in terms of how you live those values within the space and the sphere of politics. But there's always a common thread. Everyone must come to church being trained how to live the values of Christ anywhere in the world, in any sphere, in any domain. Then they must specifically then zoom in into the domain in which they're called into. So I must affirm the person's calling into politics. I must embrace that calling without necessarily giving him preeminence in the church because it's equal to everybody else. But I must affirm that calling as a God-legitimate call of God upon a person to serve a nation. I must teach him servanthood. I must teach him humility. But I must also teach him to really embrace leadership as a call of God, not to shy away from influence the world. So he must feel the church understands his calling, embrace, prays for him, loves him for who he is rather than what he does. And therefore we must disciple him properly. And then teach him about other politicians in the Bible. There's another thing is of God. Kings were raised by God. He puts up kings and he puts down kings. So you must know that, it's God put you there for a reason. And this is how that you have to govern yourself if you're serving God. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Pastor Afrika. My question is, looking what has happened like in our country, like based on education and in everything that is happening now. You look at education, it's been changed. It's like it has been watered down. And then now looking at generational like legacy, we look at what's happening. What will happen tomorrow with the education that has been downwashed? You look at the education that is now like it's like it's nothing, and then looking at the grading. You check maybe like let me say 2015. You check for matric, it was like about 30% pass grade. Now looking at that, how as the church can we intervene and help on this thing, because of it's like we are leaving nothing for them looking at the education aside.
Yeah. Well, I think that, firstly, I think we as a church don't understand education that much. And we give it a platform and a space which is beyond what it deserves. I think there is an idolatry of knowledge in the country where we idolize knowledge to the degree that a person who doesn't have knowledge is devalued. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is acquired from institutions, but wisdom is received from above. So you can have knowledgeable people, but not wise people. So now education is not the standard of success or achievement. Wisdom is. So we then have to look at the space of how we understand education as a church. In ancient times, after the Reformation, knowledge and education was given, and church was at the forefront of that in terms of missionary schools and literacy project. But it was never done in such a way that only so-called secular knowledge was at the primary core. It was also inclusive of biblical teaching. Okay? So it's not just about passing a grade. The way people are tested today, about passing a grade, people are not trained in terms of their capacity mentally and in terms of what God has already put inside of them. They're not trained to release their potential. They're trained to pass. So passing a grade doesn't mean you know anything. You just pass the grade. So a lot of people pass, but they don't have knowledge because they memorized information and wrote an exam, but they can't do the very thing that they've just passed. So we need to go back to a place where we impart true knowledge, not just. So in fact, I'm not in favor of exams. I'm not in favor of exams. I think that people must be tested in real life. I mean, there was no exams in the Bible in terms of written exams. People have to pass in experiential knowledge, practicing what they've been taught, and being tested in real life. I mean, I did X plus Y, I did all those things. I don't know, I've never used them in my life. I don't know why they made me do those things. So I failed mathematics as a result. So I failed mathematics. But I did not know that failing mathematics is not an indicator of mental acumen. I thought it almost destroyed my life because that's how we were gauged. If you don't pass math, you're not brilliant enough. I didn't understand that there's actually different intelligences that we have. That I might not mathematically be inclined, but I've got linguistic abilities. That the person who is, So, I mean, I don't know if you know about the 7 classes of the brain, that we've got 7 intelligences. So you have a child who's kinetic, who can dance, who's tested to do maths. What for? You've got a child who's artistic, who's tested in maths. What for? You know? So we, therefore, are not training our children well. In fact, we destroy. I mean, there are kids who cannot pass because they're given the wrong test. They're not tested in what their potential is. So even the way we design ministry has to be different. Christ taught them and then put them on testing. The demon was there. There's no test there. There's no exam. The child is manifesting demons here. Cast out the demon. Imagine you have to write a test. How do you cast out a demon? You put the person here. Doesn't work. What if the demon manifests differently? I don't think I've answered him. So at one level, as much as you're talking about downgrading of standards, the standards, the way they are designed in the first place, for me, I think it's a problem. Our kids, you need to first of all assess our kids' ability, and then send them to schools that are able to celebrate that ability and train the person. If they're artistic, they must be sent to schools that will train artistic abilities. Rather than sending other schools that frustrate their ability because they make them sit in the class. Their kids cannot sit in the class the whole day. Yeah. They're fidgety because they're kinetic. They're fidgety. And their schools put them behind a desk and the child cannot function. They have to sit somewhere. Some classrooms are being designed differently now. They have bouncing balls. The kid is sitting in a bouncing ball because the kid cannot, he is always fidgety. So they must sit in a bouncing ball. Now he's sitting, he can enjoy the class because he's now moving. That's his nature. You know? And some kids are sports-like, they're sportsmen. And it's good to just send them in the field and they thrive there. I've seen kids thriving when they're out there than when they're in the classroom. And I realize that it's unfair for that kid to be seen to be a dumb kid because they're tested in a test that is actually good for somebody else who has more ability to acquire knowledge and store knowledge. Okay, so I think it's even the design of education, the way it's constructed, I think it destroys people more than anything else. We again have come to the end of the program. My name is Afrika Mhlophe. The program is called Pressing Matters. We are talking about church and politics, and that's done for this time. And we're going to come back again on this Pressing Matters, and we're looking at a different topic. Join us again. Thank you. Bye.